It was a cold, stormy night when it all began, the kind of night where the wind howls through the trees and the rain taps incessantly against the windows. I had just settled down in my living room, wrapped in a cozy blanket with a hot cup of tea, when I heard it. A faint whisper coming from the hallway. I froze, straining my ears. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I slowly got up, my heart pounding in my chest. As I tiptoed towards the hallway, the whispering seemed to move, slithering through the house like a ghostly serpent. I reached the hallway and flicked on the light. Nothing, but the whispering persisted. Now coming from the kitchen. Clutching my phone, I crept towards the kitchen. The shadows seemed to dance around me, playing tricks on my mind. I reached the doorway and peered in. There, in the middle of the kitchen, stood a tall, gaunt figure, cloaked in darkness. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure turned, revealing a face twisted in a grotesque smile. Before I could react, the figure lunged at me. I screamed and ran, stumbling over furniture, desperately trying to escape. I locked myself in the bathroom, trembling with fear. The whispering was now right outside the door. "Let me in," it said, its voice cold and malevolent. I held my breath, praying it would go away. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. Silence. I dared to open the door, peeking out cautiously. The hallway was empty. I crept out, every muscle tense, ready to flee at the slightest sound. As I reached the living room, I saw it. The back door was wide open, swaying in the wind. Gathering my courage, I stepped outside, looking around frantically. There was no sign of the intruder, but as I turned to go back inside, I saw them, footprints, wet and muddy, leading away from the house. They stopped at the edge of the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I never found out who or what invaded my home that night, but I can still hear the whispers in the shadows, haunting my dreams, reminding me that some terrors are never truly gone. It was the night of the big game, and I had the house to myself. My parents were out of town, and I was enjoying the freedom, lounging on the couch with a bowl of popcorn. The excitement of the game had me on edge, but it was a different kind of tension that made me glance towards the window. That's when I saw him, a figure standing just outside, staring in. My heart skipped a beat. I blinked, and he was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too much adrenaline and sugar, but the unease lingered. I tried to focus on the game, but my mind kept drifting back to the window. The figure had been so still, so unnaturally silent. I decided to get up and check all the locks, just to be safe, as I walked through the house. Every creak and groan of the old floorboards seemed amplified, setting my nerves on edge. I reached the back door and double-checked the lock. Satisfied, I turned to head back to the living room when I heard it. A faint tap on the glass. I whipped around, my heart racing. There he was again, closer this time, his face obscured by the darkness. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick, and edged towards the door. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response, just that eerie, unblinking stare. Without warning, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to navigate. As I moved through the house, I could hear soft footsteps behind me, always just out of sight. I made it to my room and locked the door, my hands shaking. I dialed 911, my voice barely a whisper as I explained the situation. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it might already be too late. Minutes felt like hours as I huddled in the corner, listening to the footsteps grow louder, closer. Then, silence. I held my breath, waiting. Suddenly, the door handle rattled violently. I screamed, bracing myself for the worst. Just as the door burst open, the power came back on. The room was flooded with light, and I saw him clearly for the first time, a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, holding a knife. Before he could move, the sound of sirens filled the air, and he fled. The police arrived moments later, but the intruder was gone, vanished into the night. They found no trace of him, no clues to his identity, but I knew he was still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. I had always been a light sleeper, and that night was no exception. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the floor downstairs. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The house was silent, except for that faint, persistent noise. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed out of my room, careful not to make a sound. As I descended the stairs, the scraping grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the living room. I peeked around the corner and saw it, an old battered suitcase, slowly being dragged across the floor by an unseen force. I froze, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? But who would do such a thing? As I watched, the suitcase stopped moving and the room fell silent. I gathered my courage and stepped into the living room, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of an intruder. That's when I noticed the door to the basement, slightly ajar. I had always hated that basement, dark, damp, and filled with old forgotten things. But now, it seemed to beckon me, as if holding some dark secret. I took a deep breath and descended the creaky stairs, each step echoing in the silence. At the bottom, I flicked on the light. The basement was just as I remembered it, cluttered and musty, but something was different in the corner. I saw a small locked door that I had never noticed before. Curiosity got the better of me. I rummaged through the old boxes until I found a rusty key. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside was a small, windowless room, empty except for a single chair and a stack of old newspapers. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, trying to open it, but it was locked tight. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned, but the room was empty. The air grew colder, and I heard a faint whispering, like the one I had heard before. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the room with a deafening roar. I covered my ears, sinking to the floor, praying for it to stop. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispering ceased, the door creaked open, and I stumbled out, gasping for breath. I fled up the stairs, desperate to escape the basement and whatever horrors it held. I never went back down there, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the faint sound of scraping and the whispers calling my name. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend at my grandparents' old cabin in the woods. I needed a break from the city, and the solitude of the forest seemed like the perfect escape. I arrived on a Friday evening, the sun setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was just as I remembered it, cozy and rustic, with a large stone fireplace and creaky wooden floors. I unpacked my things and settled in, looking forward to a peaceful weekend. As night fell, I made a fire and sat down with a book, enjoying the quiet. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps, crunching through the leaves. I stood up, peering out the window, but saw nothing. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just an animal. But the footsteps continued, growing closer. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the still night. No response, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. I walked around the cabin, shining the light into the shadows. Everything seemed normal, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to relax, but sleep was impossible. Every creak and groan of the old cabin set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, footsteps, Now inside the cabin, I froze, my heart racing. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving through the kitchen and towards the living room. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter and hid behind the couch, my breath shallow. The footsteps stopped, and the cabin fell silent. I waited, every muscle tense, ready to spring. Then, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. "I'm here." I gripped the knife tighter, my mind racing. Who was in the cabin with me? Suddenly, the fireplace roared to life, flames leaping up and casting eerie shadows on the walls. I jumped up, knife in hand, and faced the intruder, but the room was empty. The footsteps resumed, now coming from upstairs. I crept up the stairs, the old wood creaking under my weight. The footsteps led me to the attic door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my flashlight flickering. The attic was filled with old furniture and boxes, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the corner, I saw a figure, pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It stood there, unmoving, watching me. I backed away, my heart pounding. The figure stepped forward, and I bolted, running down the stairs and out the door. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the knife still clutched in my hand. I drove away, not daring to look back. I never returned to that cabin, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the footsteps and the whisper that haunts my dreams. I'm here. It was an ordinary Tuesday night when the vanishing man first appeared. I was home alone, watching TV, when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man standing there, tall and thin, with a disheveled appearance and wild eyes. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes boring into mine. I felt a chill run down my spine. "If you don't need anything, I'm going to close the door," I said, trying to sound firm. As I started to close the door, the man stepped forward, placing his hand on the door to stop me. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have to help me. They're coming for me." I hesitated, torn between helping him and protecting myself. "Who's coming for you?" I asked, but before he could answer, he vanished right before my eyes. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. What had just happened? I checked the locks and windows, making sure everything was secure. As I tried to calm down, I heard a noise from the living room. I crept towards the sound, and there he was again, the vanishing man, standing in the middle of the room. "How did you get in here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just looked at me with those wild eyes, a look of desperation on his face. "Please, you have to help me," he repeated. "They're coming." I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Who are you?" I asked. "What do you want from me?" Before he could answer, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. I spun around, and when I looked back, he was gone again. I ran to the kitchen, but it was empty. The back door was open, swinging in the wind. I called the police, but they found no evidence of an intruder. They told me it was probably just my imagination, a result of stress or lack of sleep, but I knew what I had seen. Over the next few weeks, the vanishing man appeared several more times, always with the same desperate plea. "You have to help me. They're coming." Each time, he would vanish before I could get any answers. Then, one night, he didn't come alone. I was in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard voices, whispers, growing louder. I opened my eyes to find the vanishing man standing at the foot of my bed, surrounded by shadowy figures. "They're here," he said, his voice trembling with fear. The figures moved closer, and I felt a cold, suffocating presence fill the room. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figures reached out, their icy hands closing around me. The vanishing man looked at me with pleading eyes, as if begging for forgiveness. Then, everything went black. I woke up in the hospital with no memory of how I got there. The doctors said I had been found unconscious in my home, with no signs of injury or forced entry. They couldn't explain what had happened. But I knew the truth. The vanishing man and his pursuers were real, and they had finally caught up with him, and now they were coming for me. Which of these terrifying home invasion stories kept you up at night? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling tales.